Hello and welcome to WTO Forum. The problems of today are global in nature and require global solutions. But a variety of geopolitical and economic circumstances have made decision-making at multilateral level difficult for governments and the organizations to which they belong. Trade for sure, but climate change and international finance have been areas where governments have failed to deliver multilateral agreements. As a result, many governments are now turning to plurilateral agreements in an effort to try to open trade in a way which they can't do here at the WTO in a multilateral way. So the question is, are these plurilateral arrangements laboratories that can funnel into the multilateral system with new ideas for the 21st century, or are they a threat to the multilateral system and a stumbling block to progress for agreements here at the WTO? We're very fortunate to have with us two former chairs of the General Council, Fred Agah, Nigeria's ambassador to the WTO, and Stuart Harbinson, the former permanent representative of Hong Kong, China to the WTO. Gentlemen, welcome. Fred, let's start with you. Laboratories or stumbling blocks?
Well, thank you, Keith. I think the issue is one of a paradox. First and foremost, the agreement establishing the organization, Annex 4, clearly allows for plurilateral agreements in the WTO. Secondly, the negotiating modalities in the organization also allow for plurilateral approaches. The only difference is that the outcome of those plurilaterals should feed into the schedules of the members and are therefore applied across the board on an MFN basis to all members. So I don't think plurilaterals are a strange thing in the organization and against the workings of the multilateral trading system. The problem arises when members begin to use plurilaterals as a tactic to run away from the hard decisions that they need to make. And in doing this, that would be a stumbling block to the organization. It will frustrate the efforts to reach out at agreements that would lead to further liberalization. It's not just an issue of the coalition of the willing, but it is an issue of all members coming together collectively to make those consensual decisions that will serve the benefit of the system and the world at large. So I think in a way, the permissiveness of the rules and jurisprudence of the system are there, but the actual administration and behavior of the membership is what begins to serve as a threat to the system. So if consolidation of regional trade agreements into plurilaterals is good, it should not be a matter of further fragmenting the organization. I think this should be the issue for the membership.
I think I largely agree with what Fred's just said. Certainly plurilateral approaches to trade agreements are nothing new to the WTO. There are ways in which these can be done within the WTO, and also there are methods that can be used to have plurilateral agreements outside the WTO. And let's not forget that we've got 400 odd preferential trade agreements out there already in the form of FTAs, RTAs, etc. What perhaps is interesting now is that there are some new approaches being undertaken which are not always regional in nature, but are more subject focused. For example, services, and this is a slightly different development than we've had before. As far as I'm concerned, I feel that these initiatives or initiatives such as the so-called International Services Agreement, which is being discussed by some 19 WTO members, I understand, is born out of frustration with the negotiations that we've had multilaterally in the WTO in the Doha round. And I have some sympathy with that, I must say. For example, services is a hugely important subject. It's important in every economy in the world. It's the most important segment of every economy in the world. And yet, for 12 years in the Doha round, it's played a very minor role in the conduct of the multilateral negotiations as a whole. So I have some sympathy with this, but I share Fred's concern that this must feed back into the WTO ultimately and be a building block and not lead to fragmentation of the multilateral trading system.
So it's a question then, Fred, really of how these particular agreements are structured, whether they're open to others and to all, or closed and reserved just for those who may be participating at that time.
Well, I don't think it's substantially just whether it's open. The idea is there is a multilateral trade agenda. For developing countries, they have struggled to negotiate certain special and differential provisions in the agreements. Are we saying that the plurilaterals would erode those? We are concerned that plurilaterals will erode those kinds of gains that developing countries have made. Secondly, which issue is important? Is it services or is it agriculture? So you need to be careful as to whether either out of a coalition of the willing against the consensus of the majority, which issues you begin to extract into plurilaterals. And I say this because for many members, agriculture is an ongoing agenda that came out of the Uruguay round and remains on the table. So whether you make a decision on services, which is where you think is important, or you bring in new issues like investment, competition, and whatever, or trade facilitation, which you think are important to you, there are those who are still concerned with the past practices in the organization. And a situation whereby members cannot agree because there are lack of confidence and trust amongst themselves, a plurilateral approach like the International Services Agreement only heightens those fears and does not serve the interest of the organization.
Yeah. So the fragmentation is structural, political, and textural then.
Well, I wouldn't quite put it like that, Keith. I mean, I certainly agree with Fred that the multilateral approach is definitely the first best approach that there is. But we also have to be realistic, and the WTO framework does permit groups of countries and economies to get together to discuss issues that they want to discuss, and if they can and if they want to reach agreement on a subject or a range of subjects, provided these conform with the rules which are written into the GATT and also the General Agreement on Trade in Services now. So there's a limit to the objections that can be made if a group of countries decide of their own initiative to go outside the WTO and to just start to discuss some of these issues. We can say we don't like it, but we can't stop countries doing that. And as I said earlier, I think there's an element of frustration on their part which is driving this agenda forward. I think where I do agree with Fred very much is, it depends on the substance of the outcome and what they negotiate. And there is a danger that this could lead to fragmentation, because if one group of members goes away and does a particular agreement in one area, another group may say, well, we would like to do our own agreement on that, and they'll go away and do a different type of agreement. And then before you know it, you have several different standards in the world economy. So, I can't object to them taking this approach. I just hope that the participants in this type of plurilateral approach will bear in mind the need to bring this back into the WTO and not to fragment the global trading system.
Fred Agah, your final thoughts.
Well, I agree on the members' freedom to negotiate any agreements, plurilateral agreements that they may wish. I am only concerned that in doing that, they focus on what the issues are. The WTO comprises of agreements, rules, and principles that have been negotiated and agreed by members. So a plurilateral that focuses on market access amongst those participating members, I don't think anybody will quarrel with that. But if it begins to look at those kinds of behind-the-border measures that impinge on how the multilateral rules are applied, would begin to create a problem for the rest of the membership who are not participating in those negotiations. So you could do deals that achieve your market access or liberalization objectives, but certainly it should not be deals that begin to provide new commitments outside what members may have agreed without their consensus.
Stuart Harbinson, you have the last word.
Well, I think my final thought would be that this argument that we're talking about between plurilateralism and multilateralism can be totally avoided, actually, if the WTO can start to move forward and to produce results from multilateral negotiations. And I think maybe that's what we should be thinking about, that maybe the members of the WTO ought to be thinking deeply now about the possible costs of failure to reach agreement in Doha and in the multilateral forum, and try as hard as they possibly can to produce some results. Because there's a kind of skeptical community out there, particularly amongst the business community, who's beginning to think that the WTO is out of business when it comes to negotiations. That has to be proved wrong, and then we can forget about these plurilateral types of approaches.
Stuart Harbinson, Fred Agah, many thanks to you both for being with us, and thanks to you for watching WTO Forum.